Welcome to QDL. QDL is your look at who and what is making news in the world of quality. I'm Dirk Ducharme, Editor-in-Chief of Quality Digest. Recently, the Thomas 2021 State of North American Manufacturing Report came out. That was a couple months ago, and there were some interesting findings in there. According to Thomas, there has been a significant increase in reshoring interest. About 83% of manufacturers indicate that they are likely to, extremely likely, to reshore, up from about 54% in 2020. On the other side of this, 40% of respondents reported price as the most significant barrier to reshoring. Total cost of ownership is the most significant motivator for reshoring, according to the report. The report also has some interesting conclusions. I love this one. If 4 in 5 U.S. manufacturers bring on just one new domestic single contract supplier, it will inject about $443 billion into the U.S. economy. That's fairly significant. So here to talk about the report and some of its implications is Tony Uphoff, President and CEO of Thomas. Tony, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Dirk, great to see you again. Thanks for having us on.
Sure. Let's start off with that first figure that I threw out. 83% of manufacturers are extremely likely to add North American suppliers, up from 54% last year. That's pretty significant. Can you speculate as to how much of this is due to supply chain disruptions? And I'm thinking specifically maybe the pandemic. But there's been others as well. There's the Suez Canal thing, and there's still tariffs, and there's a lot of supply chain disruptions, natural disasters. So is this a case where manufacturers over the past year have really just focused on reshoring because of all these different disruptions?
Yeah, I think it's important, Dirk, to look at 3 key elements here. So I'll go back a little bit in time to go forward. We've actually seen the acceleration of reshoring to North American manufacturing for the better part of about a dozen years. And it's been growing steadily every year for about 12 years. So that, I wouldn't say that's new, but boy, has it certainly accelerated. And I think there are 2 drivers to your insights there, Dirk, that really drove this. First were the tariffs that were enacted, 2.5 years ago.
Yeah.
Feels like old news today by other standards. But the tariffs, particularly around raw materials like steel and lumber, as you remember, were 24 or 25%. And that caused some disruptions in here. Then you add in the pandemic. And the pandemic caused supply chain disruptions for a range of issues, not the least of which is raw materials. You take something like rubber. Well, rubber you don't think of as something that's strategically important as it would relate to the pandemic. But when you actually look at the demand for nitrile gloves, as an example, it completely blew to smithereens the supply chain of something like lumber. So I think you have to look at those 3 things. But without question, Dirk, the pandemic has been a radical accelerant to reshoring, because I think what it's fundamentally also done, whether you were disrupted or not, it caused every major and minor company to reevaluate the health and the vibrancy and, frankly, the strategic management of their supply chains.
And what's to me is interesting is that as much as that figure that 80-some% want to reshore, price is still on their mind. And I want to point out a couple different things. So you mentioned 40%, I believe it was around 40%, still say that price is kind of very important to them. And when you look at the industries or the types of suppliers that were affected, I believe you mentioned packaging materials, metals, and hardware were the most needed products in the United States and Canada. So they're looking for suppliers of those products, but those are also products where price is very sensitive, and it's still cheaper to kind of make them overseas. So how are you going to balance that out? We want to bring it home, but we don't want to pay a whole lot for it, and they're still cheaper to manufacture outside the U.S. and Canada.
Well, your voice went up like it was a question when you said they're still cheaper to make overseas. The reality is, I think that statement is being directly challenged in a lot of areas. And I'd give you just a couple of interesting perspectives before we get into the data. You'll well remember Jeff Immelt, who ran General Electric post Jack Welch, and he gave an interview recently. It was actually last week on a podcast called The Knowledge Project. And it wasn't about reshoring. It wasn't about North American manufacturing, but in context of a different question, he basically said the following. He said, it is now just as competitive to manufacture products and services in the United States as it would be in China or in Mexico, quote unquote. We just don't always want to talk about the issues involved in this. Now, he wasn't making a political statement. He was simply making a statement that under his leadership, General Electric was rewarded by shareholders for outsourcing a lot of manufacturing. But in the 90s into the 2000s, they started to bring it back because it made good economic sense. His point was at $6 an hour in Mexico versus $25 an hour in Kentucky, and he named the state. He said, when you look at the advances in manufacturing and the talent and the skill levels and the quality, he said, it evens itself out. Now, is it fair to say that thesis on his part, which is quite experienced, does that apply to every product and service? The answer is no. And that's one of the reasons that you see on the survey, there's gradations to which categories are looking to reshore for domestic sources for individual types of products and services. So I think you got to look at this in totality. I think the other thing about it is, boy, I never remember TCO being bandied about in manufacturing, which stands for total cost of ownership, but boy, is it being discussed now. And I think as you get into I can manufacture it for $1 in China and it costs me $4 to manufacture in the United States. When I fully bake those costs, I think you're seeing a lot of companies, to be clear, not every one and not every situation, but are reevaluating the underlying math when you add in advances in technology and the ability to bypass some of the complexities of global shipping. I think those costs are being reexamined today.
Well, does that, and that makes me wonder, does that tie into, there was another little factoid that jumped out to me. Two key barriers to reshoring are price and lead times. And it sounds like you're saying, so if I understand, price and lead time from the supplier, or price and lead time for what would happen here if they tried to manufacture those things in the United States?
Yeah, I think in this context, I'm really, Dirk, addressing price on behalf of the supplier, the ability to manufacture a part of a product or service that's going on to a buyer. I think that's hand in glove, though, with obviously the price that they could charge for that. I think lead times get increasingly, you can't have one without the other, right? If my price is far cheaper, but I'm going to go to 120 days on lead times on something that I need a 30-day window on, that price becomes irrelevant to me. And so I think that, you have to put those pieces together. I think one of the reasons that particularly the look towards North American, you're seeing a huge build out of small footprint manufacturing facilities where fundamentally we're locating these close to clusters of customers, and we're bypassing, and technology is enabling our ability to do this, but we're bypassing the need to deal with global shipping and the complexities and time, frankly, the lead time of getting a product or service into the hands of a customer.
Well, I mean, so is what's needed to reshore, is it a change in mindset that people, they're just stuck in this idea that, well, it's just cheaper to go to China or Malaysia or India or wherever, Mexico. It's just cheaper to do that, and they're not really looking at the overall cost? Or there's still some things we need to be doing on the U.S. side, investing in whatever it is, investing in automation, investing in technology, or whatever it takes to help bring both manpower costs down and raw materials costs down here in the United States? Is it a little of both, or?
Without question, Dirk, both are true.
Okay.
Right. So you've seen North American manufacturing, particularly U.S. manufacturing, become far more competitive on the global stage when it comes to cost. When you add in the quality component that's always been resident, right, you now see a much more competitive environment. Are there going to be spot examples of products and services that there is a substantial price differential to outsource that to another country? The answer is yes. I think those gaps, though, Dirk, are coming down really, really quickly. You take something that's becoming almost mainstream today, which is additive manufacturing or 3D printing, and you look at the almost magical capabilities of this technology. 4 or 5 years ago, you and I would not have been having this conversation in context of a serious manufactured, product or service. Today, if it's not mainstream, it's becoming mainstream. So I think your point is that it's the combination of that. You also mentioned, the cost of automation and the cost of skilled talent. You want to bring those in line. If anything that's holding reshoring back, I think it is that skilled labor side of it.
Sure.
Because, there's a lot of open jobs. This is not a new concept. I think what is slightly new, Dirk, I was asked recently, are these blue collar jobs or white collar jobs? I said, hey, that's the wrong way to look at this. These are new collar jobs. These are high tech jobs with the skill of craftsmen and manufacturing experience. And it's not easy to find people that have that combination.
Right. Another thing another item that kind of came to light in that report was, it says North American manufacturers can stand out by focusing on improving product availability and turnaround time across product and service categories that are experiencing a significant year-over-year increase in demand. Can you explain that a little bit?
I think it really just relates more than anything, Dirk, to this idea of lead times. The number one thing that we hear from procurement professionals, engineers, and MROs is really lead time. And the lead time has two kind of components. One's obvious, one might be less obvious. The obvious one is if I strike a deal with you for a volume supply or even prototyping on something, I need to really be highly confident of the lead time, and I need to improve the lead time. The other component of this is the time it takes to get the answer on the lead time.
Right.
It seems kind of funny, but you hear that complaint from procurement folks that it takes a very long time, particularly oftentimes they're working with smaller to medium-sized manufacturers, to get to an understanding of exactly what is the lead time. It's not like that data is transparent out there somewhere. It's not like we cover that on the supplier profile of thomasnet.com. We can't calculate the lead time of a supplier. The buyer has to work through a process to do that.
Now, this is probably a good chance to segue into kind of a slightly different thing we talk about there, you talk about in the report. You mentioned the transition from just-in-time to availability optimization. And before we talk about that a little bit, just define what availability optimization is.
Yeah, it's a shift from a pure cost analysis, which really was what just-in-time did, to bring in other data elements so that you're optimizing your supply at any point in time. Think of it almost like dollar cost averaging and investing. You might buy high, you might buy low, but what you want to do is to make sure that you're always able to consistently buy. And so optimization is factoring a ton of other data elements into this. What's my total cost? Are my costs evolving in other areas? Am I saving money on shipping? So therefore, I don't need to scrimp as much on the cost of production. And there's a lot of other factors. And it requires a certain amount of, Dirk, we would consider to be real-time data and analysis and multiple inputs. So there's a certain level of data science to being able to optimize something. By definition, you got to have all the data elements to be able to do that, versus I take in an order and I don't carry any inventory or supply. I want to turn it around as fast as humanly possible, which has been the historic model that a lot of companies have operated based on.
So it came up several times during the pandemic, almost as a joke, but maybe kind of joking on the square, of just-in-time maybe isn't such a good idea anymore because people weren't, there was no buffer built in. So now you have these delays, and so now, oh my gosh, there is no just-in-time because there's nothing in the pipeline and I don't have a buffer. So does availability optimization, does this help mitigate those types of things that came to the fore with just-in-time?
You know, the answer is yes.
Okay.
Take an example of PPE as a category,
Sure.
personal protection equipment. You know, before the last year and a half, many of us didn't really pay much attention to it. We might not even have known what that acronym stood for. Imagine that you were a buyer for a chain of hospitals and you were buying masks, gowns, and nitrile gloves. I'd be willing to bet that over the course of your entire career, the volatility of that supply and demand probably moved 1 or 2%, and
Right.
suddenly you have a year where it goes up by 6,000%.
Right.
So availability optimization would look at that and be able to say, perhaps for that chain of hospitals, hey, you know what? That's a category we should oversupply.
Okay.
We should overstock. And that may be in our best interest because it's not a perishable good in the traditional sense.
Right.
And boy, the risk of being caught flat-footed, you know, we're seeing fair evidence, and companies aren't, you know, particularly public companies, aren't promoting the fact, but we believe that we're seeing in our data, because of the increases in demand, some level of, let's call it overstocking. Second and tertiary suppliers, we're seeing, you know, companies shoring up supply chains and really, to a certain extent, doing, you know, part of optimization is I need risk mitigation here. I might need more than one supplier. Perhaps, you know, the other side of just in time, I may have been getting by with a single source.
Sure.
Boy, I've got to be really careful today. Maybe I can no longer just have a single source. So again, supply chain optimization and this or availability optimization is evaluating alternative sources as well. That's another set of the data that you have to analyze.
Okay. So before we go here, was there anything in that report that that surprised you, or is there anything there that you think is of maybe more importance?
Yeah, I think just the accelerated growth of reshoring did surprise me, Dirk. You know, the year before we had seen 54%, which we had thought was a substantial number. We've been, you know, involved with the Institute for Reshoring in America and looked at their data, so we knew this was building and developing. I think that leap really was stunning to us to a great extent. We also capture a lot of anecdotal, you know, qualitative comments against the quantitative data, and some of the comments about how focused companies are in finding suppliers in North America for products and services. That somewhat surprised. I would also say, I wouldn't say I was overly surprised by this, but boy, it's stunning to see the aggressive adoption of advanced manufacturing technology as well.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think, Dirk, we're sort of seeing, you know, these things work hand in glove. We're seeing a step change in both technological capabilities. You know, every year it gets cheaper, faster, better, and the technology is getting really remarkable.
Yeah.
But I think what is happening, particularly here in the U.S., is I think there's a little bit of a game of catch up. And I think there are some companies here in the U.S. that realize, you know what, we need to wipe out the technical debt. And so they're jumping into far more advanced manufacturing technology. And I think the good news is that technology is available today, and I think it's making a material difference. But I would say those would be the two things: the pace with which reshoring is accelerating and the adoption of advanced manufacturing technology by U.S. companies.
You know, I had an interesting discussion on this with somebody about a month ago, because we were talking about, you know, the importance of, you know, automation to help with reshoring, because it, you know, it helps do more with less. But this person said, well, but aren't the Chinese and the Indians, and aren't they using automation as well? I mean, isn't automation happening on both sides, and isn't still the determining factor the cost of human labor then? I mean, all other things, and maybe this isn't fair to say, all other things being equal, and maybe they aren't, but if everybody's still doing automation and additive manufacturing, then still the differentiator is the cost of human work, right?
Yeah, I think there's some element of that you know, I hope in our lifetime that never goes away, that is absolutely the case. I think the human element is obviously baked into the formula here. You have rising labor costs in China, and you have rising labor costs in Mexico. So bear in mind, it's not a zero-sum game. Nothing stays static in that regard. I think you're also, what is very difficult from the outside looking into the industry is to understand the implications of logistics too.
Sure.
when you realize of getting, when you getting products and services into the hands of other companies who are going to finish them off, I think we tend to underestimate how complicated that is and what's the time value of money.
Right.
If 30-day lead time goes to 60 days, that double lead time, there's money connected to that.
Yeah.
So it's hard from the outside for us to calculate, okay, what's that worth on the dollar per hour rate we pay labor, right? And if I have it closer to customers' facilities and I don't have to deal with those lead time issues, at the end of the day, when you pull those costs all the way through, does it really factor in? I also don't think that, to your point, that what we're witnessing is a race to the bottom. That's actually not what's happened in a lot of technology markets. As you've looked at the adoption of technology in other marketplaces, if you look at what's happened in finance, you look at what's happening in the computer and electronics industries, you look at what's happening in business technologies, all the discussion of, oh my God, in financial services, everybody was going to be replaced by a computer.
Right.
There's more people working in finance today than at any time in history. Literally in history. And so,
Right.
I don't always buy the myths that, oh my God, it's a race to the bottom and, cheap labor is going to be the only way that we do these things. I think industries tend to adjust to those things.
All right. Well, we'll leave it at that. Tony Uphoff, President and CEO of Thomas. Thanks once again for coming in on the show. It's always fun.
Hey, Dirk, it is always fun. Thanks so much for having us on.
Hey, no sweat. And that is it for today's show. Obviously, as we always say, if you have any ideas or any guests or products you'd like to see on the show, just let us know. Email us at qdl@qualitydigest.com, and we will do our best. That's it for today. So long. Thanks for joining.